If you've ever wondered what would happen if every gun control law that our politicians talk about almost on a daily basis were ever enacted on a federal level, what would that do to Americans and gun ownership? Well, today we're going to talk about a place that went to those extremes, and now we're starting to see the repercussions and some of the fallout from that. Of course, I'm talking about Australia, which had one of the most severe forms of strict gun control that anybody's ever seen. As a matter of fact, it's been used as a platform for some of our politicians to say that's the model we need to go after. Well, today we're going to compare and contrast a little bit how Australia started the strict gun control, what happened in the years following, and what's happening now. I think it'll be interesting when you think about if that was enacted here in the United States, because there's one big difference. It may not be what you're thinking either when it comes to Australia versus the United States. So we'll get into that as well. And of course, I want to hear your opinion, whatever it might be. Do you think Australia went too far with this? Are you even surprised that Australia is now kind of in the place they are after so many years of calling for all of this gun control? Let me know what your opinion is. Let's go ahead and jump right in. So in 1996, there was the Port Arthur shooting, which essentially 35 people ended up losing their lives. After that, there was a massive centralized effort to get rid of guns. And it wasn't only people in the government calling for this, but citizens agreed to it as well. It was like a national outrage, essentially, when this happened. So essentially what they do is they get federal government and the states in Australia to come up with the National Firearms Agreement. The NFA, coincidentally named something very similar to what we deal with here in the United States, but the NFA over there actually banned semi-automatics and shotguns. And we're talking about all semi-automatics. Basically, every gun ever created was essentially banned. And then they levied Medicare for an entire year in order to pay for a buyback program. This cost them like $350 million, and they ended up seizing 650,000 guns. Almost a third of all of the guns in the country, boom, they were sold to the government and then destroyed. And then a few years later, they do a handgun buyback, and they ended up getting like 68,000 handguns brought back. Now, before 1996, there were sporadic calls for gun control, but it wasn't really seen as anything serious. Like, guns were a part of their culture from, the frontier in Australia. These guys use guns. I mean, Australia's a pretty freaking dangerous place, as you already know. I mean, just the wildlife alone, it seems like everything over there could pretty much kill you with one bite, one strike, whatever. Some of their snakes and freaking everything they have over there, it seems absolutely terrifying. I'm not a snake person though, so I'll just go ahead and throw that out there. But I mean, it's a dangerous place, and so guns were seen as something totally normal to them and kind of their lifestyle. Now, they don't have a right to bear arms in their constitution. That's going to be important for something we're about to talk about. But guns were seen as totally normal. They had about 3 million to 3.5 million, some estimates say, before 1996. And here's why so many politicians look to Australia as this being the gold standard. Because they're like, look how much crime has actually dropped in Australia due to the firearm ban. Now, it's really easy to say that. But Australia their crime rate was already dropping into the mid and late 80s. And in the 90s, especially, you started to see crime drops almost everywhere in the world, right? The United States has seen a significant reduction in crime as well. Now, yes, they have different social nets, they have different housing and healthcare programs and all that kind of stuff. So some people look at those safety nets and they say, hey, that reduces the desperation that some people may feel in the United States, where you don't have as many social nets when it comes to health, housing, and all that. Some people point to that as being a clear indicator why they have less crime, along with them banning guns. But there's also something else Australia does. There's actually quite a few things they do. First of all, they have no borders, really. I mean, no other land mass borders them. They have borders. Their immigration is very strict, and they're able to easily control it because of their location. But they do control it. Pretty much everybody there that is illegal has overstayed a visa. So they're strict on immigration, right? They have some advantages for sure, but that doesn't mean they just let any and everybody just come in there. That's important. The other thing too is a lower gang activity. Now there's some notable motorcycle clubs out there and stuff like that, but it's really isolated and fragmented. At one point there was like a concerted effort to kind of get some of these motorcycle clubs and stuff, you know, down. They were able to reduce it from like 184 clubs down to like 32 now or something like that. But you don't see the high number of territory type gang activity like you do in the United States. They have about 100,000 people there illegally, where we have about 27 million according to some reports. That's two really big things, because the problem is we know that not everybody that comes here, especially illegally, conforms to our societal norms. It doesn't mean we're all robots just all doing the same thing. That's obviously not true in the United States. But there are certain societal things that have been passed down since the beginning of our nation that we all pretty much adhere to. And there's a lot of people here that just simply don't follow it, or they just simply don't care. But here's what's happened in the years since. Essentially, you've had all of these states in Australia that have fragmented levels of support. So some states say, you know what, we're going to comply with the NFA. Other states say, we're only going to comply to a certain degree. I mean, they have everything. A gun registry, which still isn't complete, like 30 years later, by the way, is a good thing. They had the buybacks, mandatory secure storage, and even a good reasoning clause why you would need a firearm in the years since 1996. But again, all that's starting to fall apart and gun ownership is back on the rise. Yet we don't see a huge surge in crime in Australia. Same in the United States. Huge surge in firearm ownership since the 90s, yet crime continues to drop. Even with two totally different places, like the United States, with all the issues that we do have, firearm ownership goes up, yet crime still drops. Problem is, when you see some of the crimes that are committed in the United States, especially the really tragic ones, they get blown up and talked about for weeks and weeks, months sometimes. And there's isolated areas that are super dangerous. I'm not saying that there's not, but we have problems here that start inside the household when kids are really young. And remember, 15 to 20 years old, essentially, males are generally the ones that commit a lot of the crime pretty much anywhere. So when you don't have good direction starting out, the chances of you getting direction from somebody are going to be high, but that doesn't mean you're going to get direction from the right type of people. And you've had a bunch of political pushback in Australia too that says, hey, we're not going to allow you to just strip firearm rights and leave people defenseless. They estimated that, there's like 100+ people in Australia that have 100+ guns each. They say one person has 385 guns plus. Now, the fact that they know that is kind of a problem. We wouldn't want that, right? But Australians and their local governments essentially took their firearm rights back, even without a constitution. That's pretty impressive. Pro-gun groups over there have done a great job to push for this, but they knew that they couldn't get it all back at once. It's taken 30 years, essentially, in order to get firearms back in the country. They deserve a lot of credit. They still have a long way to go, right? They expect that registry to be done by 2028. I'm sure that's something they want to get rid of. There's no reason you should know every single person that has every single gun in that country. Same way in the United States. Fortunately, though, we have a protection for that. A protection that is supposed to shield us from politicians being able to take guns. Unfortunately, though, in our country, there are states that go against that Constitution and decide which firearms are safe enough for you to have, knowing the whole time that criminals are just going to get whatever they want. And it's not like crimes still weren't committed in Australia or the United Kingdom or some of these other places. They always want to talk about gun crime, not violent crime, because understanding in places where they take your guns away, violent crime sometimes tends to go up. Point is, people are going to create harm if that's what they want to do with any means that they have in which they feel they can get the job done. And it's unfortunate, but that's the world we live in. But disarming people in the process creates a pathway for violent criminals to be more violent and have less resistance. And here's the truth of it, right? And I've said this before and I'll continue to say it because it is the truth. Our framers understood this. If we give people the right to bear arms, that is basically keeping our government in check. That's why they did this. But they also understood that there's a price to freedom. People don't like to talk about it. They certainly don't like to hear it. I don't like the fact that innocent people lose their lives because others want to create chaos and cause harm to others. And while there are some people that will abuse the right for sure, the vast majority of us won't. The more they start to water down that right, it becomes less of a right and seen more as a privilege. And once they take it away, the chances of you ever getting it back in full are going to be slim to none. That's why we push back so hard on any little thing, because as soon as they can get one thing in, they'll go to the next and the next and all of that. And so staying vigilant, getting real pro 2A politicians in office and holding them accountable. Once these rights are stripped, man, it's so hard to get them back, and it took a place like Australia 30 years to do just that. There you go. There's my opinion. I'd love to hear yours. Let me know what you think down below. If you like what I do, consider subscribing. See you in the next one. And as always, holding down.